the white settlers that are coming into the Great Plains are going to have to deal with a major threat, the Plains Indians. Plains Indians are going to number around 250,000 people, and they include many different tribes. For example, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Apache, and other ones. Most whites are going to see these Indians as impediments to the advance of what we would call civilization, and they were threats to the lives and property of these new settlers. The Indians, of course, are going to see the Americans as invaders, violating their hunting grounds, and like all invaders, they need to be repulsed. Now, the Plains Indian culture is going to make them very fearsome opponents. The Indians of the East Coast are going to be more settled. They're going to fight mainly on foot, whereas Plains Indians are highly nomadic peoples. They're going to be on horseback, and only in the wintertime would they be less mobile because of the fact that their horses cannot stand the weather too much in terms of traveling. The Plains Indian culture is also reliant on the buffalo and the horse. The horse gets the Plains Indians around, in particular following the buffalo herds. The buffalo, kind of think of them as a Walmart and four hooves. Everything that the Plains Indian needs, they're going to get from the buffalo. The meat can be, obviously can be for food for everybody, and it can be preserved, and so that they can live through the lean months. The hides can turn into clothing, can turn into housing. Bones can be turned into tools. Sinews can be turned into strings for bows and arrows. Even the bladder can be used for canteens and stuff like that. So the Plains Indians utilize as much of the buffalo as they possibly can. They're a highly militaristic people. They fiercely protect their hunting grounds and are just as apt to make war on other tribes as they are against white settlers. Now, although Plains Indians do have chiefs, the power of the chief is certainly going to be limited. They lead by example and social position, but he cannot give orders in a command sense. For example, a chief may pledge that he will stop raiding, but other members of his tribe may continue to do so. Now, the first invasion of the Plains Indian hunting grounds occurs in the 1840s as white settlers come into areas like Missouri, Kansas, Texas, and Minnesota. California's Indian population shows you exactly what happens when white settlers show up. For example, in 1850, right at the height of the gold rush, the California Indian population was about 100,000 people. By 1860, it had dwindled to 35,000. Indians are also threatened not just by settlers, but miners, transcontinental railroad workers, and cattle raisers. There are some other major existential threats. For example, the reduction of buffalo herds and by both settlers and the cattlemen were the most serious threat. In fact, the buffalo is seen as the Achilles heel of the Plains Indians. Liquor is available from white traders and had a debilitating effect on the Indians. New weapons like Colt revolvers and Winchester rifles are also going to give the settlers a firepower advantage. And finally, just like their ancestors 300 to 400 years before them, Plains Indians are highly susceptible to European diseases, particularly smallpox. The U.S. government attempts to put Indian tribes in a reservation system. But these tribes are used to the freedom of movement, and they're going to resent the confines of reservation. It doesn't matter how big it is. The reservation life is boring compared to the older way of life, and the reservation system usually broke down as a result of corruption on the part of local officials or the greed of local settlers who would go on to Indian lands. Now, in 1871, we're going to see the eruption of the Indian problem, as the government would put it, particularly when the commanding general of the army, William Tecumseh Sherman, is nearly killed by Kiowa and Comanche warriors in Texas. These events are going to make Sherman convinced that the Indian problem is out of control. So he contacts and receives the advice of a fellow Civil War veteran, Philip Sheridan, and how to basically solve the Indian population. And basically, what comes out of it is known as the Buffalo Policy. The main supply source for Plains Indian is the buffalo. You remove the buffalo, you're going to remove the Plains Indians, and that's exactly what happens. Between 1872 and 1875, as many as 7.5 million buffalo are actually just slaughtered. In the winter of 1874-75, the Army will launch a campaign known as the Red River War, and thousands of infantry and cavalry will sweep the countryside searching for Kiowa and Comanche encampments. When the camps are discovered, the soldiers attack. They would burn the teepees, destroy the supplies, and kill their horses. With the buffalo gone, their homes and possessions destroyed, and ponies dead, the southern Plains Indians would come to the Oklahoma reservations and surrender. However, that's in the South. In the North, you're going to see problems, particularly in the latter half of the 1870s. You see, in 1875, gold is found in the sacred Black Hills, and miners are going to come into this area, despite the fact that there is a treaty that says that no white settlers or miners can go in there. Well, the settlers will go in, and the Indians attack. The U.S. Army responds by sending in particularly the 7th Cavalry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. He goes in, and at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June of 1876, his entire command is absolutely wiped out, including 5 of his own family members. This incident is going to be popularized in the story of Custer's Last Stand. The Army is going to quickly respond by employing the tactics of the Buffalo policy that had worked so well in the South. Now it is being done in the North. And by 1879, the Sioux are defeated and they are confined to reservations. At some point in your life, and even as you go forward into your future, you're going to be asked the question, what do you mean by that? It's always good to define your terms. And so, we use words in this class like frontier and west. And what exactly do we mean by that? So let's talk about it. Well, basically, right after the Civil War, and indeed right before, if you talked about the West and the frontier, you're talking about the area that's pretty much west of the I-35 corridor of Texas. Okay, so West Texas. The frontier is pretty much going to be anything that's west of the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex and off that way. And then, of course, if you take the I-35 corridor, which goes all the way up north, you could take it beyond the Texas borders and even into, I think, Minnesota. So, nevertheless, we need to talk about how did the Americans actually settle this area? And so, geographically, we talk about basically anywhere west of the DFW area and going up north and just anything beyond that. And the first attempt to settle on these Great Plains, rather than just going through it, really started in the 1860s. At the time period, it was usually known as the Great American Desert. Today, we would call it flyover country, because people just fly over it to go to better places like the coast, like California and the area. But nevertheless, eventually people are going to have to settle here. And so the first pioneers are going to have to make really radical adjustments to their lifestyle. For example, your clothing is going to have to change due to the fact that you now have to wear clothing that is more suited to the climate. For example, it's hotter and drier here, but it's also very cold during the winter time. So you have to change your clothing style. Plowing and farming techniques are going to change as well. For example, we're going to see that the soil, is much more hard packed. There's not as much rain, so plows and equipment are going to be needed in order to break up that soil. We're also going to see dry farming, new seeds, and irrigation practices being developed. Your diet is going to change. Look around you. There's really no natural or very few natural water sources, right? Did you know that almost every single lake in Texas is man-made? There's very few naturally occurring lakes in the state of Texas alone. So your diet's going to change from less fish to more fowl and more beef. Socialization is going to change because you have to be self-reliant, mainly because of the fact that your neighbor is not just right next to you. I mean, you walk out of your door, most likely you turn to your left, turn to your right, you can see your neighbor, right? Well, your neighbor could be miles away. So your socialization patterns are going to change. Even the scarcity of trees is going to make huge changes. For example, housing. Look around, particularly here in, north central Texas. There's not that much way of, big pine forests, right? So you're going to see that there's going to be changes in how houses are made. They're going to be made out of sod, and you're going to see fences made out of wire rather than wood. And finally, great open spaces with no roads and few rivers mean transportation problems. So by the time we get to the 1890s, the main occupiers of the Great Plains area are farmers, cattlemen, and miners. By the latter half of the 1880s, the Indian problem, as the government would call it, is pretty much under control. For example, in 1886, Apaches, led by Geronimo, are going to be defeated by the U.S. Army and are ultimately going to be forced onto a reservation. In 1890, you have the final upflare of wars and uprisings, known as the Ghost Dance War. The Ghost Dance was a dance that would allegedly bring back the buffalo, and not to mention the extermination of white settlers in the Great Plains. As a result, the United States Army goes on campaign. At Wounded Knee Creek, in South Dakota, over 200 starving and freezing Sioux are massacred by the surviving elements of the 7th Cavalry. This tragic event is going to mark the end of the Indian Wars and the Indian problem. So from 1866 to 1891, the Army fights about 1,000 engagements against the Indian populations. About 900 or 932, around almost 1,000 soldiers are killed, and about an equal number are going to be wounded, along with just under 500 civilians killed. Indian losses amount to about 5,500 killed and wounded. Now, as a result of the U.S. victory, there's going to be a misguided attempt to try to make the Indian populations more like Europeans, more like Americans. And in 1887, the Dawes Act is passed. This act is going to divide the reservations into 160-acre tracts. The Indians are supposed to live on these farms and give up their cultures. No more communal tribal way of life. No more Indian religion. They are going to trying to make Indians behave more like Americans. This law, of course, results in massive fraud, as Indians are cheated and tricked out of their lands by unscrupulous whites. In 1924, the United States government offers full citizenship rights to Native Americans. And in 1934, the Dawes Act will finally be repealed, allowing Indians once again to practice their own culture and their own religion.